What if the reason you still feel stuck isn't because you're failing, but because you've been measuring progress the wrong way? Most people think healing should feel obvious. They imagine that once they finally make the decision, leave the relationship, have the conversation, or choose a new direction, everything inside them should immediately feel lighter. But that's rarely how real life works. Sometimes your life begins moving before your heart does. Sometimes your mind reaches clarity, while your nervous system is still trying to understand whether that clarity is actually safe. And in that quiet space between knowing and trusting, many people begin asking the wrong question. They ask, "What's wrong with me?" Maybe nothing. Maybe what you're experiencing isn't failure. Maybe you're experiencing integration. That's why today's symbolic timing marker is so interesting. July 23rd marks Mercury stationing direct. Within the prophecy pulse signal calendar, this isn't treated as a prediction or a promise. It's an interpretive moment that points toward integration rather than instant momentum. Decisions made under confusion now need clean follow-through, and conversations that were avoided often need honest repair instead of polished performance. Notice the difference. Not a fresh start. An integration. Those aren't the same thing. For thousands of years, civilizations watched recurring cycles in nature and the sky. Not because they believed those cycles forced human behavior, but because they noticed that people often recognized similar emotional and social patterns during recurring seasons of life. These observations gradually became symbolic languages that helped communities reflect on communication, timing, relationships, and decision-making. Within this tradition, Mercury became associated with messages, agreements, travel, commerce, and the way people exchange meaning with one another, not as a force that controls us, but as a mirror that invites reflection. That's an important distinction, because if you believe your future is predetermined, you stop paying attention to your choices. But if symbols help you recognize patterns, they become invitations, not instructions. Think about someone who has finally ended a relationship they knew wasn't healthy. Everyone around them celebrates. You did the right thing. You're finally free. Now you can move on. Yet every morning they still reach for their phone before remembering there's no message waiting. A familiar song still catches them off guard. They still rehearse conversations that will never happen. Does that mean leaving was the wrong decision? No. It means their emotions are catching up to a truth their mind has already accepted. Or picture someone who spent years working in an environment where every mistake was criticized. Eventually, they find a healthier job. Their manager is kind. Their co-workers are supportive. No one is looking for reasons to tear them down, yet every email notification still causes their shoulders to tighten. Every meeting still feels like a test. Nothing around them is unsafe anymore, but their body hasn't learned that yet. And maybe the most common example happens inside ordinary conversations. Two people finally say what needed to be said. They apologize. They listen. They agree to do better. The conversation ends peacefully, but afterward, both people still feel emotionally unsettled. Why? Because communication can create clarity in a single moment. Trust is rebuilt through many moments. We often celebrate breakthroughs. we rarely talk about the quiet season that follows them, the season where nothing dramatic happens, where no one applauds, where the real work is simply living differently than before. That season can feel strangely uncomfortable because we've been taught to associate progress with excitement. But lasting growth is usually much quieter than that. It's choosing not to send the angry text. It's noticing your defensive reaction before speaking. It's recognizing that your first emotional impulse isn't always your deepest truth. One of the central ideas explored throughout the pattern that runs your life is that recurring patterns often shape our lives long before we consciously recognize them. We don't simply remember events. We remember emotional sequences. We remember what usually happened after disappointment, after conflict, after rejection, after success. Those sequences become expectations, and expectations quietly influence how we interpret the present. So when your circumstances begin changing, your body asks a different question than your mind. Your mind asks, what happens next? Your body asks, can I finally believe this is real? And those two questions don't arrive at the same time. And perhaps that's the greatest misunderstanding about feeling stuck. We assume that if we're still processing, we must not be progressing. But processing is progress. Integration is progress. Learning to trust what you've already learned is progress. The problem is that we live in a culture obsessed with breakthroughs. We celebrate the dramatic moment, the announcement, the decision, the apology, the new beginning. But very few people talk about what happens the next morning. The morning after you finally stood up for yourself. The morning after you left the relationship. The morning after you forgave someone. The morning after you admitted you needed help. That is where real transformation begins. Not in the decision, in the repetition that follows it. Every day afterward, life quietly asks the same question. Will you live like you believe what you discovered? That question isn't answered once. It's answered over and over again. Sometimes in conversations, sometimes in boundaries, sometimes in silence, sometimes by choosing not to return to the version of yourself that only existed because you thought you had no other choice. Mercury's symbolism has always pointed toward communication. But communication isn't only about words. It's also about alignment. Do your actions communicate the same story your heart says it believes? Do your habits support the future you say you want? Does the way you speak to yourself sound like someone who believes healing is possible? Because the longest conversation you'll ever have is the one inside your own mind. If every morning begins with, I'm behind, I'm broken, everyone else has figured this out except me, then eventually your nervous system stops questioning those thoughts. It starts accepting them as reality. That's why awareness matters so much. Not because awareness changes your life overnight, because awareness interrupts patterns before they become identity. Maybe you've spent years believing you're bad at relationships. Maybe you're not. Maybe you've simply repeated the only communication model you were ever shown. Maybe you've spent years believing you're indecisive. Maybe you're not. Maybe you've spent years carrying the weight of making one wrong decision that taught you to fear every decision afterward. Maybe you've convinced yourself you're emotionally weak because certain memories still make you cry. Or maybe those tears aren't evidence of weakness at all. Maybe they're evidence that something mattered deeply enough to leave a mark. Healing doesn't erase the mark. Healing changes what the mark means. The scar remains. The suffering doesn't have to. And perhaps that's what this symbolic moment is inviting us to recognize. Not that life suddenly becomes easier, but that we begin relating to life differently. Instead of asking, why am I still stuck? We begin asking, what part of me is still learning to trust the direction I've already chosen? That's a very different question. One leads to shame. The other leads to compassion. And compassion is where sustainable growth begins. If today's reflection resonated with you, I'd like to leave you with one final thought. Imagine looking back 1 year from now. Will the biggest change in your life be that every problem disappeared? Probably not. But perhaps you'll notice something even more meaningful. You'll notice that the conversations you once feared became conversations you could have. The boundaries you once struggled to set became natural. The peace you once thought belonged to someone else quietly became your own. Not because one day changed everything, because hundreds of ordinary days slowly changed you. That's how real transformation works. Quietly, patiently, almost invisibly, until one day you realize the person you spent so long waiting to become has already been showing up for quite some time. You simply hadn't stopped long enough to notice. So today, instead of asking whether you're moving fast enough, ask yourself this: where has life already begun moving that I haven't yet given myself permission to trust? That single question may change more than any prediction ever could. Because you are not stuck because you're broken. You're in the integration phase. Sometimes clarity arrives before your nervous system is ready to trust it. And that's okay. That's not failure. That's what it feels like to become someone new. If today's reflection helped you recognize a pattern in your own life, I invite you to continue exploring how recurring patterns quietly shape our relationships, decisions, and identity in the pattern that runs your life. And if you'd like to explore more pattern-based reflections and resources, visit www.auriscodex.com. If this message encouraged you today, consider sharing it with someone who may be wondering why moving forward still feels so difficult. Sometimes the greatest gift we can offer another person isn't an answer. It's the reminder that they're not alone in asking the question. Until next time, keep paying attention to the patterns, because sometimes the pattern isn't trying to predict your future. Sometimes it's helping you finally understand your present